We can agree that, at the very least, the cultural legacy of colonialism is one of, thank God we finally got rid of those bastards who have now left, and now we can be independent and free, and all our dreams will come true, right? Isn't that the natural reaction when your country is not really, your people are kind of controlled by outsiders and not in their best interest? And so there's a lot of hopes that are built up with independence, which is especially, well, it starts in the Middle East around the 1940s, 50s, gets going. Decolonization and independence. You'll see in your textbook you've got the actual dates for each country. I'm giving you a broad brush, big story here. So there's euphoria about the promise of independence, hope for a better life, hope for development and recapturing the dignity of the colonized. And this is especially severe for the Arab countries. Because don't forget, Turkey and Iran are never really colonized. And in fact, in Turkey they have the self-respect and feeling of accomplishment of successfully combating the Treaty of Sèvres and getting it replaced with the Treaty of Lausanne. And so they've got like a rallying cry, like a successful war of independence. But much of the Arab world doesn't have it. Algeria, to some extent, they forced the French out, so they've got it. But what is Algeria? Its very borders are created by the French. Whereas in Turkey and Iran's case, Egypt's case to some extent, Tunisia to some extent, there's natural borders. This entity existed for some time. But in the other states, okay, we got rid of the colonialist, but this whole entity that we're in is a colonially created state. Like the French created Syria, the British create Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia is semi-natural, semi-created. It should have been the whole Arabian Peninsula, but there's Bahrain and Yemen and Qatar and so forth. But anyhow, people really expect a lot. They suddenly have states, even though they didn't create these states themselves in many instances. And what's Weber's definition of a state? Forget the triangle for a sec, but Max Weber's basic definition of a state. It's a human community that successfully claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. I'll say it again. It's a human community that successfully claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. That is our most accepted definition of a state in political science. So once again, you see why a state's not a nation, right? They're not synonyms. Now here's the thing, that's Weber's definition of a state, yet with decolonization, we have all these new states that are hardly claiming a successful monopoly on the legitimate use of force or the legitimate anything, because they're newly created states seen as artificial Sykes-Picot borders created by colonialists, and people, their passions and their energies are to other identities, either below or above the state. Tribal, clan, family, regional, or pan-Arab, pan-Kurdish, pan-Islam, pan-Turanic, what have you. So these states are under threat from all over, threats that compromise their ability to claim that monopoly on successful claim of monopoly on the legitimate use of force within that territory. So you've got your states, but not nation states. Not states where everyone's identifying really as a person of that state. The Kurds are disaffected, don't feel like they have a state that represents them. The Arabs think that The creation of 21 Arab states was a plot by the colonialists to divide them, because if they were one big Arab state, they'd be much stronger and a force to be reckoned with in the international community. The Turks have their Sèvres complex, Iran has its equivalent, and all kinds of problems bedeviling the situation. What's more is all those promises about a better future, in many cases, are betrayed. Not just in the MENA region, but all over the former colonized world. In some cases, they're betrayed because colonialism doesn't really stop. You have neo-colonialism and those debts that are still needing to be repaid, incurred. And other times because you have inept leaders, sometimes promoted by the powers. You guys know the story of the Congo for a little bit? It's the most famous example. I usually try to stay in the MENA region with my examples, but the Congo is such a famous one. So the Congo under colonial rule of Belgium is the personal property of King Leopold, the King of Belgium. And they rape it, they take everything they can from it. It's really he kills, it's one of the genocides listed in the worst genocides of the 20th century. He kills a lot of people. Finally, the Congolese get independence, I think in 1960. The first democratically elected prime minister of the Congo is someone named Patrice Lumumba. And he's a Congolese nationalist. Congo has a million divisions between different tribal groups and Lingala speakers versus Swahili and others. And Patrice Lumumba is giving a discourse of Congo for the Congolese and trying to do all these things, but he's sounding a little bit leftist to Washington and Brussels and some others. And this is the height of the Cold War, right? This is even before the Cuban Missile Crisis, just before that. So guess what they do, to make a long story short? They start supporting his head of the army, a certain colonel by the name of Mobutu, and start whispering in his ear that he'll have their support if maybe he wants to take matters into his own hands. And sure enough, there's a military coup, and Mobutu takes over, and Patrice Lumumba is disappeared, executed by the Belgians. The CIA was involved in that too. My parents met there in 1961, by the way, so I know the story reasonably well. My brother was born in the Congo. My parents were working for the UN there during the Civil War and the first years of independence. Mobutu is a real SOB who has no vision for the country and becomes the very definition of a kleptocracy. A government, a government whose only raison d'etre, reason for existence, is to enrich itself, to steal from the population. So he gets fabulously wealthy with bank accounts in Switzerland, and the Congo, even to this day, is a basket case. Yes. Total basket case. That's the extreme variant. You get other variants of this in the MENA region. Maybe more competent leaders that did have a vision, but are also very authoritarian, not accepting of democracy or liberalism or things that would get various groups in the society united, who can be SOBs as well, if you will. And what's more, the economic goods aren't about, in the Congo everyone's dirt poor, and there's like no roads built in the whole 30 years of Mobutu's rule, 35 years. In the Middle East, there's sometimes accomplishments. Like I mentioned earlier in class that under Nasser, every university graduate was guaranteed a job, and he expanded education and services for the poor. But that whole program ended up being unsustainable. It was, he did import industrialization, import substitution industrialization, and was trying to pursue a form of Arab socialism, and took on all these debts, and had a mushrooming population, wars with Israel, and in the 60s, Egypt was one of the success stories, until suddenly that whole unsustainable program especially with the war with Israel in '67, totally collapsed. And then Egypt ever since is a basket case again, where you've got your wealthy elite and the average people are not getting services, and all the promises of independence seem unkept. And that story gets repeated in many places, except for the super rich oil countries, right? Because they have the money to buy everybody off, right? In what's called the rentier states. But the poorer states, unless they get some infusion of income, Jordan gets it from foreign aid and so forth, are largely basket cases. And you got to imagine what kind of disappointment that is, right? You're looking forward to, with independence from colonialism, that all these good things would finally come to your people, but we get books in the 80s and 90s about the developing world with titles like Promises Not Kept. This was the textbook I used when I was a student in the 90s. And people like Francis Fanon, who wrote a lot of, he was a keen observer of the Civil War in Algeria. I think he was from Senegal originally. But he wrote a lot about this phenomenon. I'll give you a quick quote from him, okay? Don't try to write it down or anything, but just to know what he's talking about, the disappointment of independence. He says that the national middle class, which takes over power at the end of the colonial regime, is an underdeveloped middle class. It has practically no economic power, and in any case, it is in no way commensurate with the bourgeoisie of the mother country which it hopes to replace. The national bourgeoisie of underdeveloped countries is not engaged in production, nor in invention, nor building, nor labor. Its innermost vocation seems to be to keep in the running and to be part of the racket. To them, nationalization quite simply means the transfer into native hands of those unfair advantages which are a legacy of the colonial period. Remember what I said about the Marxist perspective? Orthodox Marxist perspective? So here the local elites are, in effect, just a local flavor of colonial rule. They've adopted all the mechanisms and trappings of the colonialists, but they call themselves Navy. And that includes exploiting the population. And so, you guys have all read George Orwell's Animal Farm? Most of you have. It's highly recommended, but in this case, the pigs lead a revolt of all the farm animals against the farm humans. And they have chants like 2 legs bad, 4 legs good, and slogans and all this. But after the humans are evicted from the farm, the pigs set themselves up in the house, in the farmhouse, and slowly start changing everything. And the slogan suddenly goes to being 4 legs bad, 2 legs good. The pigs start walking on 2 legs, and they're setting themselves up with the same exact system, but claiming to be one of the animals. Now, Orwell wrote that as a critique of Soviet Stalinism, but it can work in a lot of other contexts as well. In your readings that you're going to have next week, your textbook talks a lot about types of regimes that emerge after independence. Monarchies versus republics, democracies, not so many of them, versus authoritarian states, resource poor versus resource rich, labor poor versus labor rich, or large population. There's other categories in the textbook, like civilian versus military, one party versus hegemonic party. I don't think those are so useful. But the stuff about resource rich, labor poor, and monarchy versus republic, you should understand those differences, okay? So we get countries like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and other Arab Gulf countries. These are authoritarian monarchies, okay? With the comprador elite who cooperated with the colonialists during colonialism and now has inherited control of those countries and still retains it to this day. Those royal families that we were talking about that are still in place, okay? Absolute monarchies, if you will. And then we have countries, states like Algeria, Syria, Yemen, Libya. These are authoritarian republics. They've overthrown their monarchies that they got at independence. Sovereignty is supposed to reside in the people, but it's really a one-party system. Well, Libya is kind of chaos right now, but it's a one-party system, and the party's just for mobilization of the population. It's not to give people a choice. There's only one party. So why do you have a political party if there's only one party? It's not to compete in elections. You know who you have to vote for. Syria under Assad has always had elections, by the way. Assad got like 98, 99% of the vote every time. His Ba'ath Party and him. Which always makes me wonder about the other 1%. Like, I mean, is that just for show, to make it look like it was or do they knock on the door? Are you the one guy in this neighborhood who didn't vote for Assad? Come with us, please. You know, we want to talk to you. But these republics, their political party, the one party, is for mobilization. The source of legitimacy isn't the rational legal system, really. It's derived from representing the will of the people, the nation, if you will. Which is why a lot of them are so virulently Arab nationalists, like in the case of Syria or Algeria. Libya under Gaddafi is its own special case. In some ways I miss him. I wouldn't say that if I was Libyan, but Gaddafi used to be the biggest source of entertainment in world affairs that you could imagine. He once announced that we should solve he had the solution to the whole Arab-Israeli conflict, and it was Israel time. And a merger or something. And then there's another story my Kurdish friends like to tell. He had a Kurdish community center opened in Tripoli with a publishing arm and everything. And immediately the Turkish ambassador lodged a protest. Turkey denies that the Kurds, especially in Turkey, even exist at that time in the 70s. So Gaddafi summons the Turkish ambassador after he lodges his protest. And the Turkish ambassador was like, thank you for seeing me, I wanted to say this, and Gaddafi just stopped and was like, wait, before we continue, is there a Kurdish minority in Turkey? And so the official state line in Turkey is, of course, no. They're all Turkish, so the ambassador has to say, no. So Gaddafi said, so what's the problem? Off he goes. UN meetings in New York, he'd bring his whole retinue, including female Amazon guards, and set up tents in the garden of these estates like he was a Bedouin in the desert. So,
this is kind of a random story about Gaddafi, but so my grandma's cousin and her husband used to live in Libya, and this is before Gaddafi was in power, and they were actually neighbors. And she said that she and her husband had dinner with him once, and the entire time he was just really quiet and really angry. It kind of makes me wonder how he evolved from that to this kind of extravagant, crazy figure.
Yeah. And I think he did a lot of drugs personally. You look at photos of him in 1969 when he took power. My mom says she had a crush on him. He was a good-looking fellow, kind of sprite, and so forth. And then in his latter years, something was going wrong. Anyhow, and then we have. I've only got 5 minutes left, I think. So. Turkey, Israel, post-2003 Iraq, post-2011 Tunisia, and Lebanon are examples of democratic republics or quasi-democracies. Because, sometimes the democracy is not quite functioning right, but it's at least close enough that we're going to say that's going to be in the democratic category. Iran is its own type, a theocracy after 1979. Before that, it's a monarchy of sorts, with the Shah claiming to be, it's an old title that's supposed to be the shadow of God on earth, right? Or King of Kings, and so forth. Although it had its democratic moment in the 50s, but involvement in Iran by Britain and the US helped stop Iran from becoming a constitutional republic, constitutional monarchy, if you will. Anyhow, those are your regime types. With my last 5 minutes, I want to say something about Arab nationalism and Pan-Arabism. I'll probably have to finish this point in 2 weeks, but I want to start it now. We spoke about who is an Arab, a bit what is a nation, why nationalism becomes an important source of legitimacy, how you need a they to have a we. Maybe I didn't mention that, but you can't have a we without a they. So it helps to talk about the colonial European enemy that humiliated us, and now we're going to rise to our former glories. When we talked about the glory days of the Muslim and Muslim Arab dynasties and their decline, we talked about a psychological effect of what the memory of that epoch was. And then you kind of lost out in European imperialism and colonialism, been humiliated, and now you're independent, you expect to maybe get back up there, right? And so this notion that you were divided into 21 Arab states to weaken you, to sow divisions as still part of that divide and rule strategy, can be a powerful force. And so when the Arab countries first get independence, their populations are very pan-Arab. They don't see themselves first and foremost as a Jordanian. That's a newly created state. What's an Iraqi? You know, the Kurds definitely don't feel Iraqi. Or what's a Syrian? The Kurds in Syria don't feel Syrian. It's called the Syrian Arab Republic. Kurds aren't Arabs, right? But Arabs don't even feel Syrian. They think it should be one super Arab state for the whole Arab nation in all its glory and so forth. And this is Pan-Arabism. From the 1920s to the